All right, good afternoon, everyone. All right, we're going to try again. All right, good afternoon, everybody. All right, there we go. There we go. Barry, thank you so much for bringing us together on this important topic. I'm Susan Yaki, the director of the LaFollette School of Public Affairs, our public policy school here on campus. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Don Moynihan. Don Moynihan is the J. Ira and Nikki Harris Family Professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. An expert on government performance and public agencies, he's the co-director of the Better Government Lab and author of a popular Substack newsletter. Moynihan is also the author of The Dynamics of Performance Management and the co-author of an award-winning book, really amazing book called Administrative Burden, Policymaking by Other Means, as well as literally hundreds of articles in public administration. He's the past president of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, and he was the previous director of our own LaFollette School of Public Affairs and my very dear colleague. Don earned his PhD at Syracuse University. Please join me in welcoming Don Moynihan.
Thank you so much, Barry, for inviting me, and Susan for that lovely introduction. I'm a scholar of public administration, which was generally considered to be sort of a backwater topic within political science, something so unimportant that no one would find it of any interest. And I spent my career wishing that was not true, and then it came true, and suddenly public administration is incredibly interesting, and lots of people want to know about it for reasons that are, I think, depressing and demoralizing from my perspective. I'm going to frame my talk around one basic claim, which is that there is one way of understanding what's happening in the first 100 days is that the Trump administration is introducing a new model of politicization. And there is an old model, which was basically something that started, let's say, around the time of the Nixon administration, where the White House, both parties across administrations, centralized policymaking in the White House and strategically used about 4,000 political appointees across agencies. 4,000 of about 2.3 million public servants does not sound like a lot, but the US has a relatively high number of political appointees working in government. That equilibrium held, even though it generated a fairly uneasy balance between merits and political loyalty, competence, and partisanship. I did the classic grad school thing where you put way too many words on the slide, and I'm not going to read everything that's on the slide, but basically what it tells you is politicization of government under these circumstances tends to be associated with negative outcomes when it comes to what we think of as government capacity, public sector performance, and also some of the things we don't want to see happening, like favoritism and corruption. So as governments go from being less politicized to more politicized, they become less able to achieve basic goals. As they go from being more politicized to less politicized, they tend to become more functional and higher performing. This also matters to values other than competence and performance, such as transparency and honesty in government. In general, it's true that more politicized organizations in government are associated with higher graft, higher corruption, more waste, because there is sort of a lack of transparency and a lack of check on what is happening within government. And there are a variety of mechanisms by which politicized administrations might generate these outcomes, one of which draws from studies of Brazil during the Bolsonaro administration, is to put the fear of God into bureaucrats and intimidate them so that they will go along with your game plan. So what is the new model here? And I'm drawing from a paper that was just published in the Journal of Policy Analysis of Management. And this was also effectively my presidential address as I finished my time as president of the Association of Public Policy and Management. I think there are three aspects to this new politicization that probably overlap a little bit. There's probably some blurring here, but I think they're useful additions to what we thought of as the traditional model. The first is a personalist presidency. Barry mentioned personalism. I'll get more into what that means in a second. The second is reliance on fear and intimidation as a mechanism for governing. And then the third is sort of like a mixture of weakening the civil service system, expanding the political appointee class, and purging those who are considered to be untrustworthy or disloyal. A couple of caveats before I get into the details of each of these. First is that politicization is mostly fairly unpopular. So if you ask the public, about 9 out of 10 people of both parties will say that they prefer a nonpartisan civil service system as opposed to a more politically driven, politically controlled civil service system. So just in the abstract, when you ask people what model of governance they want, and these numbers are from, I think, the Partnership for Public Service, although Pew found fairly similar numbers from last year, mostly they will say we prefer a more professional, less politicized administration. It's also true that there's a bunch of stuff that a year ago, if we got together, we would have said, were like just not true. Like, can presidents get rid of agencies, get rid of appropriations, get rid of programs, and change civil service rules without congressional permission? I would guess 90 out of 100 or 99 out of 100 political scientists or administrative law scholars would have said, no, that's nonsense, that's silly. You know, President Reagan pledged to get rid of the Department of Education in 1980, and every, Republican candidate or president has said they're going to do that since. It's all bluster. Congress is never going to let them do that. None of these things are true. And yet, the Trump administration is doing all of these things right now. How far they'll get down the road on these items, we will see, but something like USAID no longer functionally exists. And that was a non-trivial agency that simply does not exist any longer. So the personalist presidency. Again, Barry introduced this topic, but the simple idea, and we're drawing a lot of ideas in this time period from the study of comparative politics. We're looking at democratic backsliding in other countries and looking at concepts and ideas that help us to understand what's happening in America right now. And the idea of personalism is one of those concepts. So you have a political party or movement that is built around a single individual and loyalty to that individual. Trump has taken over the Republican Party and has made it about the Trump brand. And he is now taking that value of personalism and introducing it into the federal government in a way he simply didn't do to a great extent in his first term. And this involves, most obviously, selecting people for positions of power that are loyal to him at some personal level. And so, for example, here we see a quote from his son where they're talking about screening potential political appointees for where they were on January 7th, which is a reference that they were looking for a loyalty test. Who was with President Trump at his lowest moment, the day after the sacking of the Capitol, when people thought his political career was over? Who were his supporters on that day? That is the litmus test to serve in the second Trump administration. I think the idea of a personalist presidency has been enabled both by legal decisions and by legal theories. So the immunity decision from last summer, I think, gave a very clear green light to Trump that he had significant powers that he could now play with without risks of legal retribution. Second, the unitary executive theory, which is the shorthand for this, I think is well summarized by Trump. I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. That is to say that there's a reading of the Constitution that the president is the personification of the executive branch, and he personally inhabits and controls all of the power of the executive branch, and he can use that power for any purpose. This was, I think, a relatively fringe legal theory until fairly recently, and has become a defining legal theory of Trump's second term. You see references to Article 2 powers pop up in a lot of memos and executive orders, even justification of firings for example, general counsels who have been removed from their job. I have an Article 2 power, I can do whatever I want, which includes things like impounding funds or getting rid of agencies. Trump has, in a way he absolutely did not do in his first term, successfully built a legal system to enable the personalist presidency. And we can see measures of this in a variety of ways. One is that many of the personal lawyers of Donald Trump's citizen who were defending him in court before he took back the presidency are now in positions of high power in the administration, including most obviously the Attorney General. A second is that Trump has systematically targeted lawyers and general counsels within government and also outside of government because he recognizes that the legal infrastructure is incredibly important to his project of control. So if you think about, if you're not familiar with government, think about general counsels as the internal referee, the sort of they will give you the green light or the red light that tells you whether what you want to do is legal or not legal. And so they serve as an incredibly important internal check against illegal behavior. In the first Trump administration, Trump felt that too many of these lawyers were saying no to him. In the second Trump administration, he wanted lawyers who would provide a rationale for the decisions that he wanted to make. We have seen the elimination of longstanding norms, such as the idea that the Department of Justice should be somewhat independent of the president, that the FBI was not a tool of the presidency. And we also see a defanging of other internal modes of accountability, such as mass firings of inspectors general, whose job it is to target things like waste, fraud, and abuse, which is, of course, exactly the mission statement of DOGE. The second element I want to talk about in the new politicization is governing by fear. And I think if any of you know a federal employee and have talked to a federal employee in the last couple of months, you will get a sense of how deep that fear is running right now. It's also something that is happening in broader American society. So I write a blog, I interact sometimes with journalists, I interact with people who might want to talk with me. The thing I hear from reporters, and I can confirm from my limited efforts to write about current events, is that no one wants to go on the record. No one wants their names in print. People are scared. This happens to be true for federal employees, and I think for lots of people in civil society as well. This pattern of governing by fear, I want to argue, started before the start of a second Trump administration. And so the statistics I'm showing you here are coming from last summer or before, and they're focused on state and local government employees, where employees in the public service increasingly feel unsafe, they increasingly feel like they need to exit government, they're subject to harassment, online harassment, sometimes personal threat, and they feel like their road to continuing in the public service is a fairly short one. This includes also credible threats to judges, which the U.S. Marshals tracks, which has been steadily increasing, and these are regarded as credible enough that judges are subject to additional protection. So, for example, judges in the DC area who are ruling on Trump court cases would sometimes find pizzas sent to their houses from unknown individuals, which were intended to be a signal to them that they know where you live. So this was happening to a group of actors who were not working for Donald Trump at other levels of government. And the point is that this mechanism of fear is not just dependent upon government power. It depends partly on a political movement that is willing to engage in threats and intimidation. Now, American politics, it's rambunctious, and it has always been rambunctious going back to the founding era. People argued with each other. They said terrible things about one another. So maybe this is just an extension of traditional American politics. I want you to think about this also as a strategy for governing. And this quote that you see here comes from Russ Vought, Trump's once and current head of the Office of Management and Budget. And I think in an interview, I referred to Russ Vought as Trump's Cromwell. He is the person behind the scenes that is driving a lot of the agenda without getting much of the attention. But Vought has talked about using trauma and fear as a weapon to control the bureaucracy. We see elements of this happening right now. So for example, if you're an employee that says something that's viewed as being disloyal to the administration, maybe they can't fire you right away, but they will put you on administrative leave. And they will not let you back into your office, and they will not let you access your computer. Return to office, which was a policy, which is effectively an HR policy, was really treated as a policy to make life uncomfortable for federal employees. So bringing them back to the office when it was difficult for many employees to come back, when they didn't actually have enough office space or parking space to manage those employees. This is also happening while the federal government is selling off many federal workspaces. And so the goal really is just to make the workplace more and more uncomfortable. So the net effect here is if you're a bureaucrat, there are very credible threats if you want to stay in government against your job, against potentially your personal safety, if you become a target of the administration. The third category here of the new politicization is an attack on the civil service system, plus an expansion of the political appointee class, plus a purging of the disloyal. And here is something, a year ago, if we were to have this event, I guarantee you we would not have talked about Doge. We would not have talked about Elon Musk. We did not see this coming. We do not have historical parallels to help us understand Doge. We're only just starting to come to grips with conceptualizations as Doge as a government entity. Some facts about the work of Doge. So massive downsizing of government, and that is not unusual. There have been periods, including in the Clinton administration, where over the course of 8 years, President Clinton downsized the government by about 12%. I think Doge is different in a number of respects. One is that it's arguing that it is trying to save money. Just some basic math here. Personnel costs are not where government spends money. You could cut a quarter of the federal workforce and you would save about 1% of the federal budget. Most of government spending goes towards entitlement programs and defense and some interests, right? That's the vast majority of the federal budget. I think instead, these downsizings are intended to stop agencies from functioning. So for example, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has seen about 40% of its employees put out and sort of removed from work. And also the federal government, President Trump has proposed a 40% cut in spending for NIH. And so I think they're seeing the cuts in personnel as reflective as a means of stopping the government from issuing grants, from providing resources, from basically doing its job. So it's a sort of a way of not just downsizing the employees, but also eliminating the ability of programs to function. Much of the discussion of Doge focused on the idea of we're going to have these really smart technologists come into government and shake things up and disrupt things. And guess what? There were some of those people already working in government. So the US Digital Service, which Doge now occupies, or 18F, or other agencies within specific agency units like the Office of Transformation within Social Security Administration, had a lot of very skillful technologists who were in the business of modernizing government. Almost all of those people are no longer in government. Almost all of those people have either resigned or been fired. And signature products like Direct File, a free online tax reporting system that most of the world has, but the United States does not, has been killed by Doge. If you look at the potential effects here on one agency, just IRS, according to the Yale Budget Lab, if the full impacts of downsizing of employees and creating an incentive structure where it's easier for high income earners to avoid paying taxes, the long-term costs, 10-year costs of DOJ's actions at the IRS will be about a $2.4 trillion loss in revenue to the government, which will far exceed anything that DOJ actually saves in terms of government spending. If you look at the areas of downsize, it is not a chainsaw. It is not across the board. This is a graph from the Stanford political scientist Adam Bonica, where he points out that you see more intense cuts to government agencies that are regarded as being more left-leaning rather than towards more conservative agencies. This is with probationary employees, but this will be updated as we see reduction in force data being adopted as well. Right now, we're looking at this week, the rollout of the second version of Schedule F, President Trump's plans to reclassify about 50,000 career civil servants into political appointee status. This is, again, unprecedented. Once these employees are in the Schedule F political appointee position, there's really no protection for them against political abuses, and so they can be fired easily. And that will also, I think, close a window of transparency that we have on the federal government and what activities it gets up to in the coming years. It also poses an enormous problem for whoever succeeds Trump, because then they will have 50,000 political appointees, and normally we remove all of the political appointees with an incoming administration. Will the next president remove then the next 50,000 of employees, which would have huge capacity implications? So very quickly, what are the implications for governance? Are the courts going to save us? I think in general, the courts have been broadly sympathetic to the idea of expanding executive power, reducing administrative autonomy. They can rely on the major questions doctrine to selectively check presidents when they want to. And so I'm not very optimistic that the courts will save us on all of these issues. It becomes much harder for us as scholars of public administration or political science to separate out what is politicization from just a broad-based attack on the capacity of the American government to do big things. Where we're moving towards is an administrative state that has less power, less expertise, no real practical theory of governance behind it. Like, how do we get big things done? How do we take on major tasks like climate change? How do we engage in broad collective action? I don't think that's really there. I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
All right, Don Moynihan, welcome back to UW-Madison. Thanks for sharing those comments. And for those of you who aren't yet using our QR code, please do so right now. We've got a couple great questions already. I actually want to start with one of the student questions, because that's what we want to do here, right, is really center our students. So Jack S. asks a question for you, Professor Moynihan, and that is, if DOJ's goal is to limit programs' abilities to function, is it working?
Yes. Again, we do not have a reference point for DOJ from past American history. And so I think for the first couple of months, we were comparing it to previous reform commissions like the Grace Commission or Reinventing Government. It is clearly not like that. I think we are also seeing that the underlying theory of DOJ is mostly that government activity is wasteful and that things that were created by Congress probably should be eliminated, that administrative actors provide very little value. And so, for example, in the forked in the fork in the road deferred resignation offer, there was explicit language in the Office of Personnel Management website telling federal employees that they would be better off stopping their low productivity work in the public sector and going into the high productivity work of the private sector. So explicit language on a government website that also was echoed by Elon Musk. And so I think this theory that they have about governing suggests that let's make it harder for these entities to operate. And in some cases, they're actively introducing red tape into government. So, for example, you have a federal judge that says you can cancel these National Science Foundation grants based on DEI reasons. You have to have a hold. Let's hear the substance on whether the president has these powers. So instead, DOGE is having federal employees just basically re-review every grant every time a bill comes in to fund that grant, even though they were previously reviewed, and you have very few employees left who can do this, and so it just sort of kills the agency, drowns the agency in red tape. And so it's this incredible irony that these like Silicon tech disruptors, technologists are actually purveyors of some extraordinary red tape in the American government.
So another question from one of our students. So Noah D asks, you mentioned that these strategies used for politicization of government are new. Why might Trump not have sought to implement these strategies during his first term?
I think Trump was surprised to win in his first term. He sort of famously did not engage in much pre-planning for a presidency. He fired Chris Christie, who was tasked with helping him prepare his first administration. And so there wasn't really an administrative doctrine that Trump had thought about and spelled out. When he lost, part of his rationale, and for the people around him, their understanding for why the first Trump administration was unsuccessful was that they were not able to govern the bureaucracy. And whether that is correct or incorrect, their theory was all of these bureaucrats stopped us from doing what we wanted to do. We need to start planning for a second administration right away. And so as soon as Trump is out of office, you see dozens of these little Trump think tanks emerge and start planning for a second term. So they had 4 years to develop fairly sophisticated policies and ideas. I mentioned Russ Vought. He created his own think tank, also collaborated with the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. There was enormous investment in preparation the second time around, partly because there was almost none of that happening in the first term. And so there was real lesson learning from the first Trump administration to the second Trump term.
Really great question from our audience member, Jeff M. And this is going to take Don back in time to about a decade ago when he was here on our UW faculty. What lessons can we draw from the civil service reform in Wisconsin more than a decade ago? At that time, it was deeply controversial. We hear relatively little about it these days. What consequences has it had? And what light does it shed on or could shed on our current events here at the federal level?
Yeah, great question. So I think I would acknowledge that there was a bunch of civil service reform efforts in the 90s, the early 2000s, and then including Wisconsin here, which were just not studied at all, which there's very little credible evidence about whether they were good or bad things. And I think at the time when I was here, I proposed that, okay, if we're going to do the civil service reform, let's introduce some way of evaluating whether it worked or not. There was not a lot of interest in the state government at that point in time to have some sort of formal data collection to evaluate whether civil service was achieving its goals. And so partly state governments didn't want to study these things, and I think scholars sort of dropped the ball in not studying them terribly well. The Wisconsin change in civil service laws, I think, was much milder. As I recall, it was mostly about flexibilities in hiring that made it easier, potentially introducing politicization, but also potentially making it easier to get good people in the door quickly. And I don't really know what was the outcome there. The Trump plans, I think, are much more draconian in terms of firing people, reclassifying them, and really, ultimately, if you buy into the unitary executive theory, viewing the civil service system itself as an unconstitutional constraint upon the president's ability to manage the executive branch. So it feels like a class apart in terms of scale and severity relative to what was tried at the state level here in Wisconsin.
All right, I'll take my chair prerogative to ask one of my questions. And that is, Don, if we were really forcing you to think about the Trump presidency so far at 100 days in, could we squint and find some real opportunities for meaningful reform that have taken place thus far? And what might those be?
No. Here's the thing. So as Doge started to materialize, there was a window where there was a real potential for a broad bipartisan rebooting of American government. Because there are people on the left who are not happy with American government and think it is too slow moving, it's too wedded with proceduralism. My colleague at Michigan, Nick Bagley, is writing a book on this topic. Jennifer Palka, who writes about state capacity from the perspective of a technologist. There was a lot of willingness to overlook some of what Elon Musk had said, some of what he had done, and to buy into the idea that actually these disruptors need to come in and really shake things up. And that window of possibility lasted, I think, for maybe a month into the administration, and now is dead. Right. The best case scenario at this point is that everything gets burnt down so badly that when there is a rebuilding phase, it'll be easier to rebuild, or that the normative claims around what government should do will be adjusted so much that a policy agenda that is more focused on getting things done, reducing administrative burden, reducing proceduralism will be easier for progressives to accept than it would have been 2 years ago. There's just very little that I see coming out of this administration that is genuinely focused on efficiency, certainly on improving transparency and ethics. We're going in the wrong direction. Building state capacity, I think we're going in the wrong direction. The promises on the technology side, again, Doge could have taken the US Digital Service and 18F and said, we are going to empower these actors to just go around government and really fix stuff. And they deliberately made a choice not to do that. They are ignoring the Privacy Act of 1974 and the way in which they're using data. There's a very good case to be made that the Privacy Act needs to be updated for a time period when we're not relying primarily on paper. But I think it's also possible that Doge is creating the conditions where government is going to move in the opposite direction, because we will not be willing to do data sharing at a sensible level because people become so spooked by the ways in which data sharing is being potentially abused right now.
So I have to ask this question from Alice H., who's one of our students, because it sounds like she's read your book, or at least some of your work. Do you think the heightened learning, compliance, psychological costs that result from some of these programs being cut will degrade the long-term trust of institutions by American voters?
Yeah, I do. So Social Security Administration was one of the examples in our book on administrative burden. And so I'll use that as an example. Social Security Administration is a relatively well-run agency. You could argue that it's maybe one of the triumphs of the American administrative state. The relative costs of administrating this huge program are fairly small, about 1/2 of 1% of the entire budget of SSA. When you encounter it, it mostly works pretty well. Right now, Social Security Administration is the wheels are starting to come off. And so we've already seen increases of people going to field offices because they are hearing from scammers, or they distrust what is on the Social Security website, or they go to the website and the website has crashed, or they can't get through to anyone on the phone. And so it creates this sort of vicious cycle where people are saying, what the hell is going on with Social Security? Is my money still there? Can I get help? And then they go to a field office and they overwhelm the field office. People's fate in the agency is being shaken in a way that I think has not been true in the past. I think that is like, and Social Security is obviously one of the most visible administrative spaces we encounter, especially from the federal government level. But I think that is a microcosm of the ways in which DOGE is causing people to question the credibility and capacity of federal agencies to treat their data seriously and to serve them well.
One of our audience members sort of wants to take it to the next step here, Don. So here's the question. Is the ultimate goal of making it harder for government agencies to operate to privatize them? For example, when Social Security struggles to function, isn't the goal just to make it into a private sector organization?
This is, again, I think, where we struggle with our conceptualizations of DOGE and its role in the Trump administration. It is very plausible that this is a group of private actors entering government for a limited period of time to create a structure for outsourcing of many core government sources. And so lots of contracts are being canceled now, but where will contracts be going in 6 months or a year from now? One of the things to keep an eye on here in particular is who receives contracts to run basic government services. There is like a traditional vendor model where you have these legacy vendors and consultants like Deloitte or IBM. They are not the favorites of DOGE. They want to move that money instead, I think, to newer private entities like Palantir that rely much more on technology and data sharing to solve problems. And so if we see a shift in federal contracts away from the Deloittes of the world and towards the Palantirs of the world, I think that does suggest that there is an agenda to restructure governance, not just to privatize it, but also to redirect it towards a certain type of private sector model. One final thought here is we've always thought about Social Security as the third rail of American politics. When George W. Bush won his reelection, he said he had credibility to spend, and he was spending it on the Social Security Administration privatization proposal, and ultimately that failed. Partly because when you compare the relative costs of administering Social Security via private pension providers, you realize a lot of money would be going to third-party actors rather than directly to beneficiaries. But no one would ever suggest that George W. Bush was screwing up Social Security in order to create a level of dysfunction where only privatization looked like a reasonable alternative. Like there was no sort of sense of that deliberate dysfunction by design in the way that, at least now, people suspect that of DOGE, whether it is true or not true.
One of our students asks you to sort of look forward. So after President Trump leaves office, what could path forward look like in reversing some of the cuts to federal government, or I'll just add some of the changes to the federal administrative state?
I think there are two basic paths. One path, if you want to look for an international comparison, you might look at the United Kingdom, right? Where the conservatives were in office for a very long time, basically ran on and implemented a program of austerity. The Labour Party ran on a program that criticized the austerity agenda, and then once they got into office, have not done much to reverse it. And it's so it may be that the Trump administration has created this punctuated equilibrium where for the next 20 or 30 years, some of the things I'm talking about, like the distribution of scientific research grants, the size of the civil service, the capacity of government, its ability to be an attractive workplace, is just going to be fundamentally different for decades to come. The alternative, and I think more positive option, would be that Democrats or even Republicans offer a more compelling vision of what the new American administrative state looks like. And to be clear, I think, America won the 20th century by investing in a lot of the things that we're seeing cut now, like in research and building up bureaucratic expertise. Like that was part of why the 20th century was the American century. Will the 21st century be the American century? I don't think it will be with this governance model. So I think it's up to people to present an alternative framework for governing that is different from the past, that is different from Trump, and is still compelling. We're seeing elements of this, I think, with the relatively bipartisan abundance agenda that Ezra Klein and others have talked about. And I think it's sort of fair game to talk about what does that mean. But the idea that government should be actually helping to build stuff and shouldn't get too caught up in its own way, like shouldn't prevent itself from doing big, ambitious things, is different from we should have as small as a government as possible. And it is also a more active anti-red tape agenda. At the moment, that seems like the only compelling alternative vision that I've seen being presented.
I was wondering if you were going to bring up Ezra Klein's new book. How many people in the audience have seen Ezra Klein's new book? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting take. And I think it comments a bit on the difference between process and outcomes. So the book's a lot about how process has hardened and across so many different policymaking process, then it makes it hard to get any outcomes. As a scholar of public administration, how do you understand that? And how do you think about that in today's society, especially a society where, we're sitting in a state which is, voted for Trump, and we're sitting in a country that voted for Trump too?
I should save my good takes for when Ezra invites me onto the show. I think the book and your argument raises a lot of really fundamental issues about where American governments became too focused on procedure and not enough about outcome, right? And I think that is what is incredibly compelling, and that should be bipartisan. Much of my research on administrative burden we framed in terms of what is the customer experience when they interact with government, which again, I think is sort of a bipartisan. Everyone should be able to get behind the idea that when you interact with government, you should have a good experience. You shouldn't have to wait too long. You should be treated respectfully. Things shouldn't be so complicated that you get frustrated and give up. The timing of the book is really weird, right? Like it comes out when the politics have changed so differently, and there is a real set of actions happening with the American administrative state that are unlike anything we've seen for, 100 years. And the book does not directly respond to those current politics. And so it's going to take some repositioning and engagement with how do we think about abundance in an era that also produced Doge and Donald Trump. I think a lot of the problems that abundance and its framework raises are most compelling when they focus on blue states where there is no Republican bogeyman to criticize. California is the prime example, and where they've sort of layered in too much procedures, too much red tape, and have stopped the state from functioning in an effective way. And compared to them, red states like Texas or Florida are building houses more quickly and more cheaply, and they're attracting residents to come to those states as a result of that. And that is, I think that's a compelling argument that progressives need to hear. A lot of those arguments though are about infrastructure and building stuff, getting public transportation in place, getting housing in place. There's a bunch of other stuff that is about a different type of capacity, which involves technology. And where, again, I think there's a really stark contrast between what Doge might have done, but hasn't done, and what employees in the sort of civic tech space who are smart technologists, but who actually believed in making government work better, were doing, but were never fully empowered to do. And so I would love to see more of an engagement with how do we bring actual civic tech skills into the map of rebuilding American governance.
So we have time for one more question. So Don, you're somebody who shapes public administration scholarship, trains our next generation of leaders. What do you want today's politics and policy students to understand, both about the risks to our administrative state right now, but also about its potential resiliency?
This has been a weird semester to teach public management to my students. And basically at the start of every class, we would take about 15 to 30 minutes and just say, what's happening in the news that you want to talk about? And just have a discourse about how that relates to concepts, research, and ideas, what we can learn from the past to inform the future. And it's a terrifying time for students who are invested in public administration or public policy, where they're seeing a demolition of a lot of the institutions that they might have hoped to work for or engage with if they actually had a chance to join public service. So on the one hand, I want to be very real and acknowledge those things and acknowledge that students I taught have lost their jobs. People have had come to my class and present, incredible innovators were then 2 weeks later out of the federal government. Like, this is a real moment where a lot of the values that our field cares about are not being valued. On the other hand, looking for a sliver of optimism here, I think if you're a 20-something-year-old person, there is going to have to be some moment of renewal that's going to happen, whether it's 2 years from now or 4 years from now or 10 years from now. And we are going to need all of the skills of good policy analysis, ethical public service motivation, where people genuinely care about using government to help others. And we're going to need people who can step up and serve and help to rebuild whatever the next version of the administrative state will look like.
Don, thank you for your comments.